When you encounter someone who naturally creates distance, something unusual begins to happen inside you. The absence of constant reassurance doesn't bring comfort. It creates tension. And that tension, it's powerful. It pulls at your attention, your curiosity, and eventually your emotions. Because in human psychology, what is unavailable often becomes more desirable. When someone doesn't immediately give you access to their thoughts, their feelings, or their presence, your mind starts to work overtime. You begin to wonder. You begin to analyze. You begin to seek meaning in silence, in pauses, in small gestures that would normally go unnoticed. This is where emotional intensity is born, not from closeness, but from uncertainty. When a person with avoidant tendencies enters a dynamic, they often don't follow the typical patterns of emotional availability. They don't rush to reassure. They don't constantly validate. They don't easily open up. And because of that, they create a psychological space that feels different, charged, unpredictable, and deeply engaging. For someone on the other side, especially someone who naturally seeks connection, this can feel like a puzzle. And the human mind is drawn to puzzles. We are wired to solve, to understand, to decode. So instead of walking away, many people lean in. They try harder. They invest more energy. They begin to chase something that isn't being freely given. But here's the deeper truth. The intensity doesn't come from the avoidant person trying to pull you in. It comes from the emotional gap they create. That gap activates your attachment system. It heightens your awareness. It makes every small moment feel significant. Every message, every glance, every shift in tone. In contrast to relationships that feel easy and predictable, this dynamic feels alive. It keeps you alert. It keeps you thinking. It keeps you emotionally engaged in a way that feels almost addictive. And that's why many people confuse intensity with connection. But intensity is not always a sign of a healthy bond. Sometimes it's a reflection of imbalance. It's what happens when emotional availability is inconsistent, when closeness is followed by distance, when warmth is followed by withdrawal. That inconsistency creates a loop in the brain, a cycle of hope and uncertainty that can feel incredibly powerful. The mind starts to ask, why did they pull away? What did I do? How can I bring them back? And in trying to answer these questions, you become more invested, more focused, more emotionally tied to the outcome. Meanwhile, the avoidant individual is often not trying to create this intensity consciously. It's simply the way they've learned to regulate their emotional world. Distance feels safe to them. Space feels controlled. Too much closeness can feel overwhelming. So they step back, not to manipulate, but to protect themselves. But the result is the same, a dynamic that feels emotionally charged, uncertain, and intense for the other person. And here is where strength comes into play, because while this intensity can be powerful, it can also be confusing. It can pull you away from your own center if you're not grounded. It can make you seek validation in places where it isn't consistently given. It can make you chase clarity in a space that is intentionally or unintentionally unclear. So the real question is not whether this intensity exists. It does. The real question is, can you remain centered within it? Can you recognize that what feels powerful is not always what is right for you? Can you observe the pull without losing yourself in it? Because once you understand that this intensity is a product of emotional dynamics, not a measure of your worth, you begin to reclaim your power. And in that moment, you are no longer reacting to the distance. You are responding with awareness. When someone carries a deeply reserved emotional style, what you encounter is not a lack of feeling, but a barrier that protects those feelings. That barrier is not visible in the beginning. In the early stages, there may be moments of openness, brief glimpses of warmth, and even connection that feels surprisingly deep. But as things progress and emotional expectations begin to grow, that wall starts to reveal itself. And the reality is, those emotional walls are not easy to break through, not because the person is cold, but because they have learned, often through experience, that vulnerability comes with risk. For many people with avoidant patterns, emotional openness was not rewarded in their past. It may have been dismissed, ignored, or even used against them. Over time, they learned a powerful lesson. Relying on others can lead to disappointment. So instead, they relied on themselves. They built internal systems of control, independence, and emotional restraint. Now, when someone new enters their life, that same system activates. At first, they may allow you in, just enough to feel the connection, just enough to create interest. But the deeper you try to go, the more their defenses begin to activate. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because your closeness is triggering something within them that says, this is getting too much. So they pull back. They become harder to read, harder to reach. They respond less, share less, and emotionally distance themselves in subtle but noticeable ways. And to the other person, this can feel like rejection, confusion, or even emotional withdrawal that feels personal. But the truth is, these walls are not about you. They're about protection. The challenge is that from the outside, it can feel like a closed door. You knock, you try to communicate, you show effort, but the response is limited. And when someone doesn't open up easily, it creates a sense of emotional tension. You begin to question your approach. You wonder if you're doing enough, saying the right things, or being enough to be let in. But here's the deeper understanding. Emotional walls are not broken by force. They are softened through consistency, patience, and emotional safety. Yet even then, there is no guarantee. Because the decision to let someone in is internal. It depends on whether the avoidant individual feels safe enough, not pressured enough, and not overwhelmed. This is where many people struggle, because in trying to break through the walls, they often apply more pressure, more emotional expression, more effort, believing that if they just try harder, they will eventually be let in. But emotional walls don't respond to force. They respond to safety. And even then, only gradually. This creates a dynamic where one person is reaching, expressing, and investing emotionally, while the other is maintaining distance, observing, and controlling how much access is given. And this imbalance can feel exhausting if you don't understand what is happening beneath the surface. The key realization is this: you cannot force someone to become emotionally open, no matter how much you care, how much you invest, or how much you try to prove your value. Their willingness to open up is ultimately their choice. And that is where your strength is tested. Because instead of trying to break through the wall, you must decide whether standing outside that wall is aligned with your emotional well-being, whether the effort is being reciprocated, whether the connection is building in both directions, or only in one. Understanding this doesn't make the walls disappear, but it changes your relationship to them. You stop seeing them as something you need to defeat and start seeing them as something you need to respect. And in that respect, you reclaim your own emotional balance. When emotional distance enters a connection, something interesting begins to happen within the human mind. The more uncertain the other person becomes, the more your attention intensifies. Not because you are weak, but because your brain is wired to seek resolution, clarity, and emotional completion. And when that completion is not immediately available, your mind doesn't rest. It engages. This is where deep emotional attachment can form in a way that feels almost consuming. Because when someone is inconsistent, when they give warmth and then pull away, when they show interest and then retreat, it creates a loop, a cycle of hope and confusion. One moment you feel close, the next moment you feel distant. And in that contrast, your emotional system becomes activated. You start thinking about them more often. You replay conversations in your mind. You look for hidden meanings in their actions. You try to understand what they really feel. And in doing so, your focus begins to revolve around them. This is how attachment deepens, not always through closeness, but through uncertainty. Psychologically, This happens because the brain responds strongly to unpredictable rewards. When something is inconsistent, it becomes more engaging. The mind keeps returning to it, hoping for the next moment of clarity, the next moment of connection, the next sign of consistency. And in relationships, where one person is emotionally more available while the other maintains distance, this imbalance can create a powerful emotional pull. It can feel like you're drawn towards something that is just out of reach. But here's what makes this dynamic even more intense. The emotional investment often increases the more unavailable the person becomes. Instead of stepping back, many people lean in further. They believe that if they can just understand the other person better, communicate more effectively, or prove their value, they will eventually receive the emotional closeness they are seeking. And so, without realizing it, they become more attached, not just to the person, but to the idea of finally being chosen, finally being understood, finally being emotionally met. This is where attachment can cross into obsession, because the emotional gaps, the unanswered questions, and the inconsistent responses begin to occupy mental space. The connection no longer feels balanced. It feels like something that needs to be solved, something that needs to be completed. But the truth is, what is pulling you in is not always the person themselves. It is the emotional pattern they create. The mind doesn't just attach to people, it attaches to patterns. And when a pattern is unpredictable, it becomes harder to let go. At the same time, this experience can reveal something important about you. It shows how deeply you are capable of feeling. It shows how much you value connection, understanding, and emotional closeness. Those are not weaknesses. They are signs of depth. But depth without awareness can sometimes lead you into emotional cycles that are hard to break. Because the same intensity that makes the connection feel powerful can also make it difficult to detach. You begin to associate the emotional highs with meaning. You begin to believe that the intensity itself is a sign of importance. But intensity is not always alignment. An emotional pull is not always emotional compatibility. So the real challenge is not just feeling deeply. It is staying aware while you feel deeply. Can you recognize when your focus is shifting too far outward? Can you notice when your thoughts are becoming consumed by someone else? Can you step back and observe the pattern instead of getting lost inside it? Because once you understand that your attachment is being shaped by emotional dynamics, not by your worth, you begin to regain control. And in that awareness, you give yourself the ability to choose where your energy goes. You no longer chase the feeling of completion. You begin to create it within yourself. When communication becomes unpredictable, something subtle yet powerful begins to unfold inside your mind. You start paying closer attention. You begin to analyze every message, every pause, every shift in tone, not because you want to overthink, but because the signals themselves are inconsistency. And inconsistency creates tension. One moment, there is warmth, a sense of closeness, a feeling that you are seen and valued. The next moment, there is distance, silence, a withdrawal that feels sudden and unexplained. And it is this contrast, the shift between closeness and distance, that creates psychological tension, because your brain is constantly trying to make sense of the pattern. You begin to ask questions. What changed? Did I say something wrong? Are they losing interest? Why do they feel close one day and distant the next? These questions don't come from insecurity alone. They come from the natural human need for clarity and stability. When something feels unpredictable, your mind tries to predict it. When something feels unclear, your min tries to clarify it. And when someone's behavior shifts without explanation, your awareness sharpens. This is where emotional tension builds. Not because the connection itself is inherently unstable, but because the experience of it becomes difficult to predict. And here's where the dynamic becomes even more powerful. The unpredictability keeps your attention locked in. When something is consistent, your brain relaxes. But when something is inconsistent, Your brain stays engaged. It stays alert. It stays invested in trying to figure it out. This is why mixed signals can feel so intense, because they don't give you enough certainty to feel secure, but they give you just enough connection to keep you hoping. That just enough creates a loop. You feel the closeness and it draws you in. Then you feel the distance and it creates discomfort. Then you wait, hoping for the return of closeness. And when it comes back, even briefly, it reinforces the cycle. The brain registers that pattern and says, this matters, not because the pattern is healthy, but because it is emotionally engaging. At the same time, this tension can trigger something deeper within you. It can bring awareness to your own emotional needs. It can highlight how much you value consistency, clarity, and reassurance. And when those things are missing, it becomes even more noticeable. But the challenge is that in trying to resolve the tension, many people begin to adjust themselves. They start changing how they communicate. They begin to lower their expectations. They try to become more understanding or less demanding in hopes of reducing the distance. And while compromise is part of any healthy dynamic, there is a difference between healthy flexibility and losing your emotional balance just to maintain connection. Because if you are constantly adjusting yourself to fit into someone else's level of emotional availability, you may begin to lose sight of your own needs. And that is where tension can become internal. You are no longer just reacting to their behavior. You are also managing your own emotions, trying to stay grounded while navigating the uncertainty. This is why awareness is so important when you recognize that mixed signals are creating tension, not because of your actions, but because of the inconsistency in the dynamic. You begin to step out of reactive thinking. You stop chasing clarity from a source that is not providing it consistently. You begin to observe instead of react. And in that observation, you regain your center. Because the goal is not to eliminate tension completely. That's not always possible in human relationships. The goal is to understand it, to recognize when it is pulling you away from your own stability, and to choose consciously whether the dynamic you are in is one that supports your peace or one that constantly disrupts it. Because once you see the pattern clearly, you are no longer controlled by it. You are aware of it, and awareness is where your power begins. When someone values independence above everything else, their entire approach to connection is shaped by one core principle: maintaining control over their own space, their own emotions, and their own life. This doesn't mean they're incapable of connection, but it does mean that closeness is something they approach with caution, not urgency. For them, independence is not just a preference, it is a form of safety, because at some point in their past, depending too much on others may have led to disappointment, instability, or emotional overwhelm. So over time, they learned a different way of being. They learned how to rely on themselves, how to process things alone, how to solve their own problems without leaning on others for emotional support. And this becomes deeply ingrained in their personality. So when someone tries to move closer, when emotional demands increase, when expectations grow, when the relationship starts to feel more consuming, they may instinctively pull back, not because they don't care, but because their sense of self feels threatened. To them, too much closeness can feel like a loss of control. They begin to feel like their time is no longer entirely their own. Their emotional space feels occupied. Their routines feel interrupted. Their inner world starts to feel exposed. And when that happens, their natural response is to reestablish distance. This is where the dynamic can become difficult to understand, because from the outside, it may look like rejection. It may feel like they are pulling away from you personally. But internally, what they are actually doing is trying to reclaim their sense of independence. They are not just stepping away from you, they are stepping back into themselves. And that distinction is important. Because if you interpret their behavior as a lack of interest, you may respond with more effort, more closeness, more emotional intensity. But if the root of their behavior is a need for space, then increasing closeness can actually have the opposite effect. It can push them further away. This creates a paradox. The more one person tries to connect, the more the other person seeks distance, not out of malice, but out of differing emotional needs. And this is where emotional awareness becomes essential, because you have to recognize that not everyone experiences connection the same way. Some people feel connected through closeness, through shared emotional space, through frequent communication. Others feel connected when they have room to breathe, when they have space to process, when they are not emotionally overwhelmed. Neither way is inherently wrong, but when two different styles come together without understanding, it can create friction. For someone who values independence, being constantly approached, constantly engaged, or constantly expected to respond in a certain emotional way can feel draining. It can feel like pressure, and pressure triggers withdrawal. So they create space, and in that space, they feel more in control, more balanced, more like themselves. But here is where the deeper reflection begins. If you find yourself constantly adjusting to match someone else's need for space, you may start to question your own needs. You may begin to suppress your desire for closeness, for communication, for reassurance, just to keep the connection intact. And over time, that can lead to internal imbalance. Because healthy connection is not about one person constantly shrinking and the other constantly expanding. It is about two individuals who both feel respected in their needs. So the question is not whether independence is good or bad. The real question is, can both people exist in a space where their needs are acknowledged? Because if you are always the one reaching and they are always the one retreating, then the connection becomes one-sided. And that is where awareness protects you. Because once you understand that their independence is not a reflection of your value, you stop taking their distance personally. You stop trying to force closeness where it is not being naturally met. And instead, you begin to respect both their need for space and your need for connection. But most importantly, you begin to honor your own emotional balance, because real strength is not in chasing someone who values distance. It is in recognizing when to give space and when to choose yourself when you find yourself drawn into a dynamic where emotions feel uncertain and responses feel inconsistent. Something important begins to happen within you. You start to see not just the other person more clearly, but yourself as well. Because these kinds of connections don't just test your patience, they reveal your emotional patterns. They bring to the surface your expectations, your boundaries, your fears, and your sense of self-worth. And in that process, you are no longer just observing someone else. You are confronting parts of yourself that usually remain hidden. This is where growth begins. When someone does not immediately meet your emotional needs, you are faced with a choice. You can either adjust yourself to gain approval and maintain connection, or you can stay grounded in your own values and observe whether the connection aligns with who you are. And this choice is not always easy, because human beings are wired for connection. We want to be seen, understood, and valued. So when someone feels important to us, we naturally want to bridge the gap between us and them. We want to feel close. We want to feel chosen. But in doing so, many people begin to lose sight of their own center. They start to overextend. They give more than they receive. They try harder, communicate more, and invest emotionally, even when the return is inconsistent. And slowly, without realizing it, they begin to shift their focus outward, toward the other person, instead of inward, toward their own emotional stability. This is where the real lesson lies. Because difficult emotional dynamics are not just about relationships. They are about awareness. They force you to look at how you respond when things are not easy. They show, dear you, whether you remain grounded when your emotions are tested or whether you lose yourself in the process of trying to hold on to someone else. And that is a powerful mirror. It shows you where you may be seeking validation instead of self-assurance. It shows you where you may be compromising your own needs for the sake of maintaining connection. It shows you where your boundaries may need to be strengthened. At the same time, it also shows you your capacity to feel deeply, your ability to care, to invest, to remain open, even when things are uncertain. These are not weaknesses. These are signs of emotional depth. But depth without direction can sometimes lead to emotional exhaustion. Because if your energy is constantly directed outward, trying to understand, trying to fix, trying to connect, you may neglect the most important connection of all, the one you have with yourself. And this is where the true shift happens. When you begin to turn your awareness inward, you start to ask different questions. Instead of asking, why aren't they giving me what I need? You begin to ask, what do I need in this situation? Instead of asking, how can I get them to open up? You ask, is this dynamic aligned with my emotional well-being? These questions move you from reaction to reflection, from emotional dependency to emotional awareness. And that is where your strength grows. Because when you start to understand yourself more deeply, you stop relying on someone else to define your emotional state. You begin to recognize your own patterns. You begin to notice when you are overextending. You begin to feel when something is not aligned. And most importantly, you begin to choose differently. You choose clarity over confusion. You choose consistency over uncertainty. You choose emotional stability over emotional chaos. And in doing so, you don't become less caring. Yours become more grounded. Because true growth is not about shutting down your emotions. It is about understanding them, guiding them, and making decisions that honor both your heart and your mind. So instead of seeing these dynamics as something that pulls you apart, begin to see them as something that builds you. Because every moment of confusion, every moment of distance, every moment of emotional tension is an opportunity to grow stronger, an opportunity to become more aware, and ultimately, an opportunity to become someone who no longer loses themselves in the process of loving someone else.